It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Lund Boothroyd from Durham. Lynda did her... I'm going to be brief because Linda's got a lot to talk about. Lynda did her PhD with Dave Perrett at St Andrews. She spent most of her career at Durham. She started off working on faces, but it expanded out into doing bodies as well, which I think is a wise decision. She's been looking not just at a narrow Western European perception, but looking more widely, cross-culturally, and I, for one, find it very interesting.
Okay. Thank you very much. Is the microphone working? People at the back. Excellent. So, the thing Martin didn't say is that the reason I started working on bodies is because I went to what was to become EHBEA, but was not yet EHBEA in Montpellier back in 2007 or 8. He and I were sort of neighbours in the poster session, and after several glasses of wine, I tried to explain to him why I thought he was wrong about how he interpreted his data. And then when I got back to Durham, I, more soberly, emailed him and said I thought of an experiment we could do to see who was right. And to preempt one of the slides later in the talk, it turned out we were both right. And so was born a beautiful collaboration and a whole new chapter to my career. So, if I work out which is forward, there we go. So what I thought I would do is talk about sort of the developing thoughts I've had about sexual selection and culture and how we need to maybe rethink some of what we used to think in terms of how the patterns in these sort of theoretical perspectives and research have mapped onto my career from being a brand new baby A-level psychology student or just starting at university when evolutionary psychology was really starting to come forward through to what I now think 20-something years later. So I'll take us from the 90s and these ideas about universals in attractiveness through to what we were starting to think when I was doing my PhD about systematic variation, and then the questions I started asking during my PhD about how we even understand what the underlying adaptations are. Then I'll talk about a very big project that Martin and I did together and how that really challenged some of what we've been thinking up to that point. And then we'll talk about basically why potentially everything is domain general cultural learning at the end. So, yes, 1990s. Fun fact, I nearly quit psychology in the first term at university because it was nothing like what I thought it was going to be based on A-level psychology. And then Anne Campbell bounced into the room about halfway through the first term and started teaching evolutionary psychology, and I decided that maybe actually psychology was fun after all. So at this point in time, there was a lot of interest in trying to understand what the universals were in terms of what we found attractive in others. So the idea that the things that we think of as beauty ideals and beauty standards may in fact reflect past selection where individuals have been helped to find an appropriate mate by these inherited preferences. So the principle would be that we like these things because they signal some quality about the individual, and by mating with them, you are gaining the benefit of that quality. So that idea was coming out in the 90s. And the sort of things that were proposed as potential sort of universals of attractiveness included health, that we should like people who look healthy because then we'll benefit from being with a healthy person. Potentially facial averageness, that was really pushed by Judith Langlois, the idea that actually it's all about these basic patterns we have of faces. Also, there's some suggestions that people who are more facially average or less distinctive might have more diverse genotypes, and that might reflect some underlying health quality. A lot of work on symmetry, facial symmetry and body symmetry, where people thought that might be more attractive because it indicated underlying health. Facial femininity was proposed as something that might indicate underlying estrogen levels and fertility. So if you mate with a feminine woman, whether that's in her face or having this 0.7 waist-to-hip ratio, you would be likely to have more offspring. There was also, cropping along behind all of this, the people who weren't so much interested in physical attractiveness, but just mate choice in general, were very interested in the idea that we were interested in other people as potential sources of material and ecological resources, and that also might be something that feeds into mate preferences. So this is more or less what I've just said. So if the physical features are guiding us to advantageous mates, then what we should see is that you like health because healthy genes lead to you having healthy children, and therefore the better success of your genes through subsequent generations. So yes, spatial averageness might be associated with more diverse MHC genes, meaning you're born with resistance to a slightly wider array of different pathogens. Some people argue symmetry was healthy. There was, in the 90s, this idea that facial masculinity and dimorphism in men indicated underlying health. I have put a little ha-ha because we will come to why I spent quite a chunk of my career demonstrating that that probably wasn't true. And yes, fertility, fertile partner, more children, better success of your genes, and femininity and wisdom ratio were there. In terms of resources, there's some arguments came up that maybe people like bigger bodies in some places than others because it indicates that you've got access to food resources. So that's why Westerners liked thin women and other people didn't so much. But also, when it came to dimorphism and masculinity, maybe that indicated male-male dominance and therefore was a proxy for access to resources. So, the problem is, even in the 90s, it was already clear, if you were looking closely, that these universals that were being proposed early on did not really exist. So Judith Langlois did this meta-analysis and theoretical review where they tried to argue that basically everyone's idea of what an attractive face is correlates across different age groups, across different ethnic groups, across different cultural groups. So you can see here I've highlighted the row where they show there's this very very strong effect size in terms of the association. We also see quite high heterogeneity. When you look at the 17 effect sizes from 9 studies, what they were actually looking at was 2 studies comparing the US and Taiwan, 2 comparing the US and Korea, 1 comparing the US and China, 1 comparing the UK and Japan, 1 comparing the UK and the US, and just 1 study, 1 paper, that actually did a properly broad cross-cultural analysis looking at the US, Brazil, Russia, and within Latin America at the Aceh and the Huey groups. So, let's look at that paper. So what they did was they had Brazilian, American, and Aceh photographs, and they were rated by Brazilians, Americans, Russians, Aceh, and Huey participants. And if you look at the Brazilian, US, and Russian participants, they correlate fairly well with each other in terms of which faces they think are attractive. But if you look at the Aceh, for instance, the agreement within the Aceh is high. So the Aceh all agree with each other about which faces are the most attractive and least attractive in the stimulus sets they were given. But they do not particularly agree with the urban industrialized participants. There's a bit of agreement with the Brazilian participants, but none at all with the Americans or the Russians. And there's a medium level of agreement there with the Huey. So we can already see that actually ideas of what is an attractive face were not cross-culturally universal, and that the more different the cultures that were examined, the less agreement there was in terms of what is an attractive face. In terms of body preferences, Wetzman and Marlowe showed in 1999 that while, yes, if you look at Americans and Germans and Brits and Australians, there seems to be this preference for a smaller waist using these stimuli. Actually, for the Hadza, that preference isn't there. So whether you show them the thin bodies, the normal quote bodies, or the heavy bodies, that preference between a 0.7 and a 0.9 waist-hip ratio, so curvy to less curvy, is just 0. So that they're the black bars going along the axis there, whereas for the Americans, it's very clearly that they had a preference for the curvier body, even in the thin stimuli to an extent. So, they were never universals. We knew that pretty much from the start. So, that's why people got more interested fairly quickly in this idea that there might be conditional adaptations. So we're not evolved to prefer this thing, we're evolved to prefer this thing under these circumstances. So that came out, for instance, at the end of the 90s with papers, well, for faces, at the end of the 90s, papers looking at menstrual cycle effects. Do you prefer more masculine faces when you're fertile to non-fertile for the good genes? Do you prefer bigger bodies when you're hungry versus when you're not hungry? Do you prefer a different kind of individual when you're already in a relationship, so you're just looking at them as a potential extra pair partner, versus when you're single and you might actually want to be looking for a new long-term partner? Do you want different things for a short and a long-term partner? This was all becoming more and more important. And the idea was that what we want depends on what we need. So if we're thinking about these cross-cultural data, then okay, the point therefore should be that what is preferred in a given context and considered attractive should depend on what the needs are in that context. So if we go back to this list, an argument was made that things that indicate health are maybe more important when you're in a high pathogen environment. So the more circulating infectious disease there is, the more it should be important that you have an attractive, health cueing partner with good genes that your children will inherit so that they can be resistant to all these pathogens. On the other hand, so my argument would be that probably you should favour fertility cues in all cultures, although if you want to take the argument that our preference for fertility is under conscious control, then I guess you could say in high fertility environments, facial femininity and a curvy waist-hip ratio ought to be even more important. And of course, when it comes to resources, particularly food resources, we come back to this much older idea that we should favour higher body weight in low nutrition contexts because it indicates that person has access to nutritional resources. So, in terms of some of the evidence on whether you prefer healthy genes more or less in different contexts, there's some early studies showing, for instance, that the Hadza had higher symmetry preferences than British participants. The Hadza also had higher averageness preferences than British participants, but only when looking at Hadza faces. They didn't really care about averageness in European faces, suggesting again that this is a preference that is gained through experience of these faces, something we're going to come back to later. Some studies looked at whether general emphasis on the importance of attractiveness in a partner varied depending on local pathogen levels. So that's a paper from Gangstad and Buss back in the 90s, to which the answer was yes, although this was a very simple correlational study and there wasn't any kind of structural controls in terms of relatedness and things between samples. So then it came on to the idea that, okay, if facial masculinity indicates underlying healthiness, because the more masculine you are, the higher your testosterone levels, and the more you must be able to withstand the immunosuppressive effects of testosterone, then you should see stronger masculinity preferences in high pathogen environments. So the first paper that tested that, from Lucy de Bruyn, showed that yes, the higher the National Health Index became on a composite of World Health Organization measures, the weaker the masculinity preferences were. And this was based on online data. Fiona Moore and her collaborators also found that higher levels of Human Development Index, which sort of correlates to some things linked to health as well, were also associated with weaker preferences for faces of men with high testosterone. But the year after that, Isabel Scott published data which was based not on urban and online and fully literate samples, but with data gathered from both Western samples, but also anthropologists going out to small scale contexts, high fertility, high pathogen loads, and very low levels of global acculturation. And she found the opposite. So she found that the greater the disease burden, so the more cumulative years lost to infectious disease in that population, the weaker the masculinity preference. So that's the exact opposite of what you would expect. And then Ula Moszynkovska and her colleagues in 2019 showed, again, in contrast to the Fiona Moore study, that the higher the levels of sort of composite health and development in a population, the more positive the masculinity preferences were. So 4 studies, two showing one thing and 2 showing essentially the opposite. These were the only ones that actually did proper hierarchical regression, accounting for all the different levels of variance in their data, and this was the only one that actually used really diverse samples. I thought for a laugh one time, not for a laugh, I genuinely wanted to know, like, if I could map, the UK is in all of these, right? If I can map the UK, and if I can map Canada in all of these, and if I can map the countries that appear in multiple studies onto each other to try and rescale all these different measures they've used to be the same thing, what does that look like? It looks like this. This was me just playing around and trying to match it as best I could. Basically, what you have is a big blob with nothing much going on, and this is basically all of our urban samples and a couple of others. And then we have Cameroon up here, and we have our African and Latin American small-scale societies down there. So, overall, not a very strong set of evidence that anything is going on there. While all of these competing studies were coming out, I had, however, been arguing that maybe masculinity wasn't the right thing to be using to even try and understand preferences for heritable health. Because right back in my PhD, I had run just a quick exploratory set of correlations just to check my stimuli were doing what they ought to be, and I had noticed that women's preferences for masculinity in a face did not correlate at all with their preferences for how healthy a face looked. And you'd think, if masculinity indicated underlying health, preferences for masculinity and health would correlate, and they don't. So I showed that in 4 samples, I think in 2004 and a couple more in 2009. And then in 2013, I took faces of undergraduates when they first arrived at university. And then at the end of the first term, I asked them how ill they had been to see who got most susceptible to freshers' flu. And how facially masculine the guys were did not predict, in the way you would expect, how ill they got. The more masculine men reported that they had flu for more days, so they weren't more healthy going forwards. And then I think what, to me, is the really, really important bit of evidence is actually looking at heritable offspring health. Some very nice anthropologists let me have access to their data sets, and we saw that in both the Agta in the Philippines, who are foragers, and Maya farmers in Belize, there was a rough curvilinear association between the masculinity level of the dad, corrected for how old he was, because the photographs weren't all necessarily standardized by age, and the mortality rate of the offspring. And the ones that had the best, healthiest, most able to survive offspring were the ones with sort of slightly below average masculinity levels for their population. So being more masculine did not get you more healthy offspring anyway. So that rather suggested that we hadn't really fully understood what the underlying adaptation driving these preferences for masculinity was anyway. And it's not just that. So Lynda Lidborg, as part of her PhD, did a meta-analysis and found that most forms of masculinity, basically everything apart from upper body strength linked measures, did not correlate with reproductive success where the data existed. James Rutter, you should go see his talk on Thursday afternoon. He has got some really nice data showing that we think people sound sexy, well, we think men sound sexy when they're sick. So even quite salient cues of being ill aren't necessarily telling us to stay away from this person. Is symmetry actually linked to health? Well, so Van Dongen and Gangerstad in 2011 said, yes, but it's kind of concerning that the effect is so weak and noisy given the amount of data that exists on this. And then 3 years later, Nick Pound showed, using a longitudinal cohort study in the UK, that some fairly detailed health measures did not correlate at all with the body symmetry of those children. And I also, that's all just symmetry and masculinity and health, but if we think about the fertility stuff, I do urge you to go to Lynda Lidborg's talk on Thursday morning, where she talks about the current actual lack of evidence we have that facial femininity, or indeed femininity measures in general, are linked to reproductive success and fertility in women. So potentially, actually, we were not really thinking about these things in the right way at all, and that sexual selection wasn't doing this nice, simple thing we thought. So if we go back to Isabel Scott's data that she gathered with all her anthropologist collaborators, one of the interesting things is we can see, like, we've got our market economies up here, we've got the foragers and the horticulturalists down here, and then the pastoralists are sort of a bit spread out. And one of the arguments that Isabel and co made in their paper was that actually it was urbanization levels that were predicting masculinity preference, not underlying health of the population. Isabel and I were talking a lot at this time, and yeah, she was really interested in, is it all about urbanization? I thought, is there stuff going on with media? Because that changes our visual inputs, as we're going to come on to. And all of this, of course, is tied into economic development. So their argument was that urbanization is predicting masculinity preferences because in an urban environment there are more people around, and it is easier to notice, for instance, if more masculine men are more aggressive. And they showed that the more urbanized populations were more likely to have that stereotype about facial masculinity. There has just been a paper come out by Turcek et al. Suggesting that preference for masculinity in faces is indeed linked to your exposure to aggression or belief in the aggressive stereotype. I read this paper, put it in the talk, and then didn't reread it before I came today. But do go read it, because I did find it very interesting. So potentially we're just learning associations and then applying that association to the individuals we're interacting with. And Carlotta Buttress and David Perrett showed that in El Salvador, people who had access to the internet showed different preferences to people who did not. So they showed, basically, if you had access to the internet, you preferred more masculine male faces and more feminine female faces than if you did not have access to the internet. And remember, so many studies, cross-cultural studies that are done with online samples, and yet we know from this that people who are online and people who are not online have different ideas about what a person should look like. So this is where the big cross-cultural projects that we've been doing starts to come in. So this all came from a relatively chance meeting between me and Martin and an anthropologist called Mark Jameson, who worked with mosquito populations on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, and started talking to us about how that area of Nicaragua was getting increasing access to television because the government was putting in electricity cables. And that their access to television wasn't necessarily related to their socioeconomic status or their access to sort of steady year-round food and things like that. It was comparatively unrelated. So this is great. This is a fantastic natural experiment in how increasing access to globalized media might be changing what people think faces and bodies should look like. Most of that project was about bodies, and I'm going to come on to that in a minute. But to sort of wrap up on the facial dimorphism stuff, And some of you may have seen me present this online at the online HBEA a few years ago. Carlotta Buttress kindly gave us her Salvadoran dimorphism stimuli. And we got data from 260 people. I say we. Jean-Luc and Tracy got data from 260 people across 5 different villages and in Managua, the capital city, on their preference for these masculinized versus feminized male and female faces. So we've got the data from around the Pearl Lagoon Basin here, on the Caribbean coast, and Managua over here. It's very ethnically diverse, so there are indigenous groups like the Mosquito and the Rama, there are Afro descent groups like the Garifuna and Creoles, and there are Mestizo who have more European ancestry. They're predominantly engaged in fishing and horticulture, but there is some paid employment. The land is held in common, but there is increasing levels of stratification for a wide variety of reasons. They are very rapidly acculturating between when we started getting data in 2013 and when we finished for this project in 2017. We'd gone from TV being the only access you could ever have to visual media to suddenly even some of the more remote villages are starting to get accessible mobile broadband. So really, really fast changing. But crucially, you could have 2 communities, which in this case you can see one from the other across the lagoon. One had no electricity, they still had a very, very basic foraging and fishing and horticulture-based economy, and the other, they'd got electricity, and also some people had paid employment and were able to build a cement house. Oops, that's the wrong way. There we go. Because I didn't really get around to doing anything with this data until I'd already finished all the body analyses, I did it as a registered report with archived data. And we tried to come up with all the different hypotheses we could test with this. So we went for some evolutionary sexual selection-based hypotheses. So mestizo women were under much more strong male control. They would, for instance, have to ask their husband's permission sometimes to even talk to us. They were much less likely to have extra-pair partners, whereas the Mosquito and the Creole and the Garifuna women were much more likely to engage in serial monogamy, more likely to have extra-pair partners, even though it wasn't positively thought of, it was still accepted that it happened. So we used that as a proxy for sociosexual norms, the idea that when you're looking at these faces, might there be someone you're considering sleeping with or not? And the idea that should be, if yes, then more unrestricted sexual norms, then you should prefer more masculine faces, according to the sexual selection literature. We predicted a curvilinear relationship between age and dimorphism preferences because of all the papers saying you prefer more masculine or more feminine faces when you are within your reproductive years. And we thought that women who were in cohabiting relationships should prefer more masculine faces on that idea that Tony put forward that you're evaluating it as an extra pair partner. But then we also tested the economic development hypotheses, the idea that you would find the masculinity preferences were stronger in denser and more developed communities, that those with higher income or education would prefer more dimorphic faces because they're higher status, and of course that those who watch more television would prefer more feminine female faces because actresses are quite feminine, and more masculine male faces because actors are often quite masculinized. So, none of the sexual selection hypotheses were held up, and not really any of the economic development hypotheses were held up. The only thing that we really found was that basically the urban participants in Managua liked feminine female faces. So this preference for feminized female faces, which is really, really robust in online and urban and high-income country samples, only existed within the actual city, not in any of the communities. And these are ordered by sort of size and development level, and there's nothing there. And in fact, when I compared our data with all of the previous data I could find from these big cross-cultural studies, or even the targeted studies that had been using Latin American samples, that was a pattern more broadly, that if you were urban or online, then there was this preference for feminized female faces and maybe a slight bias towards masculine male faces. Whereas if you were rural and low socioeconomic status, you were much closer to sort of 50-50 on the female faces and the male faces. So this idea that actually a preference for feminized women and masculinized men is potentially evolutionarily novel does seem to be reflected in these data from more diverse samples. And when we asked participants, okay, so we went back to them and said, look, we've got these weird results. We really thought that maybe with men you wouldn't care, but with women, we thought you'd like these faces over these faces, so tell us what's going on. And basically, they were looking at the stimuli going, like, I don't really get what you're talking about. They either thought they looked the same, or they could say, oh, this one looks like, this is more clear, it's like whiter. We didn't change the colour at all. They came up with all sorts of reasons why potentially people might like one or the other, but none of it had anything to do with what we had actually changed in the faces. They never picked up any of the real differences. So they just didn't seem to really care or be particularly sensitive to these manipulations we were making in terms of levels of dimorphism in the stimuli, which is not what you see with Westerners. They can tell, and they usually have a preference, especially for the female faces. So, with the faces then, potentially we've been over-interpreting these online samples, and maybe what's going on isn't particularly connected to what we think is important. If we think about bodies, so there's a couple of studies from the Sodorkovsky showing that distance to sort of urban centres or tourist centres was potentially associated with having a more sort of Western type preference for a curvier waist-hip ratio or preference for a thinner body. Swami tested participants in 26 countries, found that in the two countries where urbanisation really meant something, which is South Africa and Malaysia, the urban samples preferred thinner bodies than the rural samples. In Austria, where being urban or rural wasn't important in terms of development level or economics or anything like that, there wasn't a difference. And across all 26 countries, those who were consuming more Western media, but not local media, preferred thinner bodies as well. So suggesting that economic development and media access might be modulating body preferences. So this was actually the main focus of that big project in Nicaragua. Over 3.5 to 4 years, Jean-Luc and Tracy collected data from 7 communities. We had high and low media access communities for each of the main ethnic groups we were looking at. They also got data from the capital city, which is this black line here. So this is showing the village level patterns, and what you can see, if we look at image BMI along the bottom, the people in the city look like Westerners, so everyone thinks a BMI of 12 is like really unappealing, not surprisingly. When you get to sort of the bottom end of healthy, the urban sample go, yeah, this is attractive, and as it gets heavier, they tail off. Whereas, if you look at, for instance, one of the very low media, the two lowest media villages are probably this one in red here, solid line, and the solid line in pink here. And it's a Mosquito community, and this is a Garifuna community. And they liked larger bodies, their ideal was much higher, and they continue to rate them quite positively, even as they got heavier than that ideal. Whereas the dashed communities from the same ethnic group, their preferences peaked at a lower level and they tailed off faster as well. Also, the low media communities had this sort of flatter relationship between waist-hip ratio and attractiveness. So having a large waist, so being less curvy, didn't pull down attractiveness ratings as dramatically as it did in these dashed and dotted high media communities. So in multi-level models, pretty much all village level variance was absorbed by the ethnicity, because mestizos liked thinner bodies than everyone else, education and TV consumption. And those were the big important predictors at the individual level as well. So that tells us, okay, media really does seem to be doing something important in relation to body preferences in this context. We managed to get, the plan had been that we really track what's going on as media is introduced, but Nicaraguan government being the Nicaraguan government, it happened all a lot slower than it was meant to. But we did find in one community where we managed to test people 3 times that when their access to media was changing, because for a while there was a satellite panel and a little TV, and then it went away, and some people went to the city and watched the TV there and then came back. Individual level of media exposure in the last 7 days was predicting individual BMI preference, and how they co-varied across time within the individuals. So we had this sort of within individual variation also being explained by TV consumption. So that was looking at preferences for these the stimuli that we were showing them. When we asked people to create their ideal woman or their ideal self, men with more TV access created a much smaller female body than those with less TV access, particularly in the lower half of the body. Women creating their ideal self, the high media village created a woman with a smaller waist relative to her breasts, which is this comparison here, and relative to her hips. So again, the waist got smaller. Overall body size didn't get smaller, but they didn't create these bodies that were as big as the men did anyway, which gets into interesting questions about sort of men's sexualizations of women's bodies and a large bottom and how it moves in dance and things like that. So TV was predicting how men thought about women's bodies and how women thought about women's bodies, even when we were letting them create the bodies rather than giving them stimuli that we had pre-prepared for them. Men creating their ideal self, again looking across the UK, Uganda and the Nicaraguan participants, was associated, the muscularity levels for how muscular they wanted to be was associated with their internalisation of media appearance ideals. And some men even said in the interviews when they were participating that, oh yeah, I like to be like the action films. So they were watching action films, internalising a muscular ideal, and then holding that as a standard for themselves. My now postdoc, then PhD student, Fabienne Andres, led on a really big systematic review of media and body image in low and middle income countries. So far, we've published the Latin American systematic review, but across the whole data set, we found 230 quantitative studies in total. Of that, only 21 studies from 16 papers or theses included rural data. 7 of those were our studies from Nicaragua. Of those 16, of those 21, 16 actually tested media as a predictor of body image or body ideals. 12 of those found significant links, 3 mixed, and only 1 found no link. We can go back to really seminal work from Anne Becker when TV was first introduced in Fiji, where the qualitative data shows that the girls were sort of starting to internalise these appearance ideals that were coming from the media. So, I see the ads on the television, I admire their fitness, their sizes. And the only real exception to that is this, the sort of data from Dietel in Argentina, where they've been working with a steadily market-integrating indigenous group. And they found that their ideal of what a woman ought to look like got thinner across the 10 years difference between 2 of their studies. But it wasn't linked to individual TV consumption or social media consumption in the quantitative data, and in the qualitative data, they again didn't get any reflection that it might be media linked. So there are some cases where we can't explain it by media, it must be something else. And this is where we can think about resources and nutrition again. Viren Swamy ran the study with male undergraduates, and hungry undergraduate men who hadn't had their lunch yet rated women of BMIs in the healthy and then what doctors would call overweight and obese ranges as more attractive than not hungry students who had had their lunch. So we can see there's real difference in how they're rating the sort of healthy weight and heavyweight bodies. Suggesting that if you're hungry, food is something that's important to you, and therefore you find more attractive these bodies of women who seem to have eaten a lot of food. Wetzman and Marlowe in their data with the Hadza found that the Hadza preferred heavier bodies in these line drawings than the American students did. But on the other hand, Ember et al., when they looked at evidence in the standard cross-cultural sample that plumpness was valued, found that valuing plumpness was actually negatively correlated with 3 different measures of resource scarcity and unreliability. So we've got one study from the Hazard showing this. We've got an urban UK sample showing that there might be something going on with hunger, but then in the SCCS, it doesn't necessarily seem to be there, at least in terms of how that data was coded. So again, we had already been told that in Nicaragua, access to media and access to food were not strongly correlated, so perfect natural experiment. So Jean-Luc really focused on this as part of the project, and he targeted 3 communities, one that had high media and high food access, which is here, one that had low media and low food access, so high nutritional stress, which is here, and one that had high media and low food access and high nutritional stress. So try and tease these things apart. I'm annoyed with myself that I did not take a photograph of the lunch I was given in Village 1. But this is a meal I was given in the equivalent of sort of between Village 2 and 3, economically speaking. This is what I could eat when I was actually in town properly. So very different kinds of food availability in different places. Actually, if you were at the conference in LSHDM, I went into this in more detail in my talk there. But basically, what we see is that you see what you'd expect, right? High TV, high food. They're rating the heavier bodies less positively than low TV, low food, and the high TV, low food are in between. But when we tried to look at what was actually predicting it at the individual level, what we found is that TV consumption and income were the strongest predictors. So this is showing, these are models, this is Bayesian regression, it's just showing like the general effect size of that predictor in all the possible models that could be run. My colleague Ulrich Bierholm did this because we knew we were too underpowered to do a full big model like this in the sort of standard way. The nutritional variables, which is how hungry are you right now, it was how often do you miss out on food, how often can you not eat what you want, how often do you have to go hungry, and then nutritional diversity, which is like of all these different things that you might be able to eat, how regularly you're eating them all. None of those correlated or associated in the big multi-level model with body size preferences. So it suggests that what's going on here is much more about TV access and potentially income, which is the other thing that is also different between these 2 villages. So we weren't able to support that. So what is going on? I've just seen the time. So before all of that, remember I said I met Martin in Montpellier, and we had this debate about what was going on with some related data he had on Zulus who'd migrated to the UK. I was like, well, maybe people like different things in a new culture because they're just visually exposed to this whole new media environment, as you are when you come to London and there's billboards and magazines and TV screens and everything. And his argument was actually maybe you come to the UK from South Africa and you're told thin is actually bad, thin is low status, thin is good, thin is high status, thin is healthy, being big is bad, which is not the norm, for instance, in South Africa, in that population. And basically what we found is you can show people thin or heavy bodies, whether they are appealing or whether they are unappealing, and you can shift preferences for thinness. So you show people thin bodies and they like thinness more afterwards. You show people heavy bodies, they like thinness less afterwards. And we could even pair very thin, unappealing, and heavy, glamorous stimuli together, show people lots of those, and again, they were preferring thinness less afterwards. So that was a paper from me, Martin, and Thomas, someone there. So that's body size preferences, so we can experimentally manipulate that. That's been shown lots of times, not just by us. My former PhD students, Katie and Louise, basically across Katie's PhD and Louise's master's project, showed exactly the same thing with almost identical results looking at muscularity preferences. So people seem to learn through visual exposure and through learning cultural associations what male and female bodies should look like. And again, there are other people who have shown that with muscularity as well. And we've just published, so there's data from a while back showing that this idea of visual exposure changing what you like, because essentially it goes back to Judith Langlois' idea about averageness. You have this average in your head of all the faces or all the bodies you've ever seen, and you just keep updating it with recent visual experience. And therefore everything you like is always being liked in reference to that prototype, that average. So when you see a whole bunch of new faces that are biased in one direction, or a whole bunch of new bodies that are really biased in one direction, then what you like changes accordingly. So that was shown to be true not just in adults but children as young as 5 by Nzuru et al. Back in 2009. And then we just about 6 weeks, 2 months ago, published some data from Anjali Batish and Amelia Parchment's master's project, and some data Evan Handy collected at the Durham Junior Scientist event, showing that we can get like body weight perception adaptation effects as well as young as 7. So this sort of sense of updating what we think a person looks like or should look like based on cultural learning of associations and on this very basic level visual exposure is very robust in adults in lots of different ways with different aspects of appearance, and we can see that it's happening in children from a fairly young age as well. And you can see it in small-scale societies. So Tony Little and Corinne Apicella showed in the Hadza that you can adapt someone to narrow versus wide eyes, and their preference for narrow versus wide eyes will shift in the direction of what you've exposed them to at post-test compared to pre-test, so we can change what kind of faces people like. When we were getting very worried that TV was not going to be introduced to any of the target villages in time, me, Martin, and Jean-Luc were all like, we need an experiment. So we ran an adaptation experiment in low TV villages in Nicaragua, where they could manipulate they'd see 4 different sort of models like this. They could make them larger or thinner by moving the mouse. Then they were shown a bunch of catalogue models that were either standard low-weight models or plus-size models. And again, we saw the same thing, that those who'd seen the large models, their ideal woman got heavier. Those who'd seen the thin models, their ideal woman got thinner. So it's a fairly diversely demonstrated process. And that suggests, so where that led me to was this idea that actually potentially a lot of what is going on is that it's about this exposure and learning process, and we've evolved to figure out from infancy onwards what people look like, because it's just efficient to do it that way rather than be very, very hardwired with what people look like. And so one of the byproducts of that is going to be that the more we see of particular kinds of faces or particular kinds of bodies, the more it's going to shift our preferences in that direction. But I wanted to sort of finish off thinking about some participant perspectives as well. And I've already reflected on the fact that when we showed them the dimorphism stimuli, they didn't know what the hell that we were trying to say about them. What we were saying about them didn't make sense. And actually, in some of the qualitative interviews and focus groups that Tracy and Jean-Luc ran, men were much more interested in shape than size, and also in what a body looked like when it was moving versus when we were showing them these strange photographs. Particularly when they were thinking about a woman for pastimes, or a woman they would sleep with, not necessarily as a wife. If we were thinking about a long-term partner, they didn't talk about what she would look like. They talked about how good and clean and loyal she would be. For the women, a really prominent theme in their focus groups was the body as God-given, and having to accept yourself because this is the body that God made for you. So yeah, the men were basically sexualizing the women. And thinking about movement in that sense. And then we also showed them images of different facial ethnicity. So we manipulated blackness and whiteness and mestizo-ness up and down, and found that they were really interested in the whiter and more European-looking faces. And they had very strong cultural ideas about how, although they were very proud of their own ethnic group, looking white was important. And marrying someone who would give you white children, i.e. children who could look high status, was important. And we found that people who were more educated had this stronger preference for whiteness in faces. And as one of my local collaborators, Venus Barry, argued, basically her argument was, as you get more educated, you just get more and more aware of the importance of looking and passing as more white than when you have less education and you're less likely to be trying to even access the roles and social spaces that whiteness can help you access. And I think a really useful thing is it's not just in Nicaragua. So a lot of the ideas about female body shape in Nicaragua, you can also see in Aileen Anderson Fye's work in Belize, and the idea of being the Coca-Cola body shape. They had this idea of not leaving yourself, where it was important to look after your body because that was just part of respecting yourself. And in the Argentine population that Diatal were working with, again, they focus on the body as God-given, and you accept yourself, and you don't worry about what you look like, because God made you that way. So I understood that God created me like this. Why would I get sad? One day I understood that the Creator created people pretty and ugly. So very, very strong sense of religiosity driving self-acceptance and downgrading appearance as something that's important. And I would argue that we're seeing, apart from this idea that, you want your wife to stay at home and be faithful, which there's some interesting stuff we can say there about paternity certainty. A lot of what's coming through actually really diverges from sexual selection arguments, and they're looking at these things in a very different way, and often a very sort of culturally specific kind of way. So, to go back to the questions at the start. Do physical features guide us to healthy mates? Masculinity is not an indicator of underlying health as far as we can tell. I've still never seen anything that's convinced me of it. We don't see good evidence that people like indices of underlying health more in high pathogen contexts. Facial femininity is not a good indicator of fertility. There's lots of recent hormonal evidence showing that even linking it to estrogen is a bit shaky. Certainly is not favoured in all cultures, neither is waist-to-hip ratio. And we don't see evidence, clear evidence, that favouring larger body weights in low nutrition contexts. So all of these particular predictions I was focusing on don't really work out when we're considering these culturally diverse, particularly rural, low-income contexts. So, my argument is that we probably need to think very seriously about the effect of visual learning of face and body prototypes as an adaptation for just general, how do you recognise your conspecifics, that then has all these spillover effects into how we think about what's an attractive person, especially when you tie that into visual culture and the potential for sort of visual culture products to then culturally co-evolve a bit with our flexible, always learning preferences. I haven't talked about overgeneralization. If you want me to talk about overgeneralization, I can, but I think there's a lot to be said about when someone is really ill. Yeah, obviously we don't like that, but all the variation we see in the rest of the spectrum is probably not super important, and we're doing a lot of overgeneralizing from what are the important extreme cases. But I will acknowledge we did not look at youth, except insofar as dimorphism is associated with how young you look. We didn't look at skin health. We didn't look at, no one's really looked at sort of gross asymmetries, like at that extreme end of the scale. So there is still scope for some evolved preferences to exist that haven't been properly tested in these kinds of contexts. The last thing I will say is the project I'm doing now, which is funded, the ERC, UKRI, ERC, Brexit, disaster combo. The money is coming from UKRI, it's an ERC grant. We're looking at body image education in low and middle income countries. We are going to be advertising posts, ideally targeting Latin American or African PhD students, so please put them in touch with me if you have people you would recommend. And we've got some online body image meetings, the first one which is going to be in September. If you want to present on body image or appearance ideals on an online cheap conference, there is the QR code. Please do take a look. There's about 10 days left to get abstracts in. So my argument is that it's probably mostly, in terms of what we've been looking at, culture and not sexual selection driving all of this. And that just leaves me to thank the collaborators and all the work I've talked about today, the postdocs and PhD students who collected the data I've talked about today, and the student assistants, and also the people who trained me and without whom I would not be here today. Thank you very much.